Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's discussion. My name is Hodan Omar, and I'm a Senior Policy Manager at ITIF Center for Data Innovation. The reason we're here today is because the United States has laid out an ambitious new global strategy to export the full US AI technology stack to countries willing to join America's AI alliance. This push isn't just about advancing the economic interests of US AI firms, it's also about shaping who countries turn to for AI partnerships and preventing them from defaulting to Chinese alternatives. But this strategy raises important questions, and today we're going to focus on three broad ones. First, what is the alliance ultimately trying to achieve, and how is it being perceived? Second, what needs to be in the US offer, both on the technical side in terms of compute, models, and data, and on the non-technical side, from financing to trust building? And finally, how should the US handle the diplomacy of this effort so that it secures lasting partnerships rather than just short-term deals? We have a terrific panel to help us unpack these questions. Thank you to Andres Castrillon, who is a Senior Director of Government Affairs at Qualcomm, Kazim Rizvi, who is a Founding Director at The Dialogue, Sam Winter-Levy, who is a Fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who focuses on technology and international affairs, and Sissy De La Peña, who is a Director and Founder at the DOT Network. Just a reminder to everyone joining, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have some for our panelists, please submit them through Slido. You should be able to see the link to that on whichever page you're watching this from. So jumping right in, the United States both needs and wants partners in the Global South for its AI alliance. There's a lot at stake, but Sissy, some analysts are suggesting that the US plan is being perceived as less as a genuine partnership offer and more as a way to sell technology and outcompete China. And that bristles. Why do you think it might be landing that way, and how might that shape countries' receptivity to working with the United States?
Hi, good morning and hello to everyone. Thank you for having me here and having been sharing all these opinions and ideas with tremendous colleagues and in this issue. And first of all, just regarding to your question, I think probably a perfect example of this would be the last Paris AI Summit, where there were some concerns about countries from the South not being able to really have a voice or a stronger voice in what was discussed at a governance level. And so in that sense, Paris Summit was a real example on how all the discussions about how AI governance and regulation and development should be taken on board, but perhaps it was very noticeable that voices from the South Bloc weren't really listened. I read an article that even someone from or a minister from a Caribbean country, if we are talking about the LATAM region, wasn't even allowed to be in the AI summit, probably because of logistic issues or it didn't register properly, wherever, but at least not even that minister was allowed to go in. So in that sense, I think countries from the Global South have been felt or probably can be felt to be left behind in the conversation. We understand that probably we are not in the race in terms of developing models or algorithms. But I think globally, all our data are there. Probably the models are also not reflecting pretty much all the data from the Global South. And it's not always the case, but it could be felt in some cases that some countries from the Global South could be piniquis. Is that the word that you call it? Conejillo de Indias, we call it in Spanish. And that's probably something that we should need to bear in mind. So, probably more than trying to put in place a product is probably what we're kind of piniquis, and our voices haven't been heard that much, such as in the case of Paris AI Summit.
Thanks, Sissy. Kazim, building on that, if countries like India are going to take part in this alliance, what kind of overarching goal would make it most appealing? Something like collective AI leadership or something else? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having me here on this important webinar. So, very important topic. And I think if India is to join an alliance or a US-led AI alliance, I think it would be important for India to be at a place where we believe that we can be co-architect of the global AI ecosystem. I think that's fundamental to how India would like to position itself. Being the one of the largest economies in the world, and with one of the largest number of Gen AI startups, India brings a lot of value, and of course, one of the biggest markets in the world as well. So I think it'll be important for India to be recognized as a co-architect to drive collective leadership. What does it mean now? First of all, it's important that India gets reciprocity in markets, right? So Indian startups, Indian Gen AI developers should have access to American market and vice versa, right? That's something which will be important. And the second is on doing joint R&D and joint research, right? So the alliance must focus on investing on research centers, open source collaborations, shared model development, and tech transfer, where the Indian talent, which by the way is serving globally and including America, from India, contributes, and the capacity is generated within the country as well, and opportunities are created from India as well, right? So that will be important in terms of joint research. I think the third is around compute and chips. I think this is the most important aspect when it comes to building AI and showcasing, an alliance where countries with shared democratic values can come together, right? And that's where US and India can co-lead this initiative. And without compute, we cannot win the AI race, right? So it's important to have possibly Indo-US compute corridors, looking at regional compute hubs on Indian soil, trusted semiconductor supply chain, enabling and working with the Indian government and the Indian stakeholders to ensure that we become an important player when it comes to the supply chains. And the fourth is on governance and standards, right? And as we are looking at global governance frameworks on AI, it'll be important that India plays the leading role in terms of developing these standards along with the US and other allied partners, right? I would also like to bring in the China factor here. And I don't know how many of you know, but China has proposed the World AI Cooperation Organization. At the recent SEO summit, AI was discussed. And it's important that any alliance where democratic countries with shared values come together, it's important that the alliance is able to provide more for the global south to join that alliance, right? And I would echo my co-panelist statements here, not just from India, because of course India has the ability and capacity and is working on developing AI and collaborations with all important countries. But I think what we need is for this alliance to ensure that it is not just a block to counter China, but it is also a sort of alliance which makes sure that you build the AI systems together, you co-create the rules, you hear everyone out, and you enable the infrastructure, you enable the corridors, you enable compute, and you ensure that there is agency, access, and ownership for all members within the alliance. And if that happens, then I have no doubts that this will be a successful alliance.
Thanks, Kazim. Sam, as Kazim said, China is the backdrop for a lot of this discussion. Can you dig a little bit deeper into how those dynamics are shaping what we're talking about today?
Yeah. So as Kazim said, I think it's absolutely clear that kind of Beijing is leaning into this narrative that while the US is pursuing kind of AI dominance, China is pitching the world on a vision of kind of AI governance that supports multilateralism, kind of embraces global capacity building, much more support for the global south. I think that's the kind of narrative that China is really leaning into. And I think they have real strengths here in their offerings to the global south. I think in particular, you can think of the standard Chinese playbook here. There's kind of three key things that they generally use to promote their technological offerings, which apply to AI too: subsidized pricing, package deals that generally bundle AI with other technologies, and a kind of sovereignty-focused narrative. So if you think about each of those, subsidized pricing, that's a kind of classic part of the Chinese model. Use state subsidies near zero profit margins. You can offer steep discounts and use that to kind of displace global competitors. And we've seen that playbook in solar panels, electric vehicles, and I think something similar could play out with AI chips. Second, the kind of bundling of AI with other technology, the kind of package deals. That's kind of a classic feature of Chinese technological exports in other domains. And I think we'll likely see something similar play out with AI too, where you offer small scale AI chip deployments, but you bundle it with 5G networks, fiber optic cable, smart city infrastructure to make these kind of packages really compelling to global South countries. And then the third is this kind of classic sovereignty narrative. The US is embracing AI hegemony. China will help countries achieve their kind of sovereignty goals with AI exports. I would say the kind of one big obstacle that China faces right now in general with its AI exports, but including to the global South, is that right now China cannot produce advanced AI chips at scale. It just cannot export large-scale AI infrastructure to countries with kind of significant AI ambitions. So that's a kind of major obstacle. But I think it can start, and I think we are starting to see this, it can start to kind of bundle modest volumes of chips, kind of small-scale exports, but with other infrastructure bundled together in kind of one package. And I think that fear is really shaping policymakers in DC, this fear of kind of Chinese chip exports kind of competing in the export market. I think that kind of is in the background of all of these, the US AI Action Plan, the recent executive order on promoting US exports. So that kind of fear of modest scale Chinese AI exports bundled in broader technology packages, I think for now, that's going to be the kind of primary front of Chinese export promotion efforts in the global South.
Thanks, and Andres, what then are the kind of, from the industry perspective, what do you kind of see as the main opportunities and challenges in building AI partnerships?
Yeah, thanks, Hoden, and thanks for having me on this webinar. So from an industry perspective, obviously I can't speak for all of industry, but from a Qualcomm perspective, and then having discussions with some of our industry partners, I think generally this has been well received. We view this as a compelling opportunity to deepen ties with the global South, both commercially and diplomatically. I think the proof's going to be in the pudding, right, and in the details. I think from an industry perspective, we have a lot of questions about how this is going to work, right? The U.S. government has done export promotion for a very long time, but traditionally that's been aimed at small and medium-sized companies. It's never really been sort of at this scale. And so we're trying to figure out the details and sort of how this is going to work. So the Sam referenced one of the executive orders that was accompanying the AI action plan, the one on export promotion. This introduces the idea of industry-led consortia, and the idea that the U.S. government's going to put out a public notice, probably sometime towards the end of next month, asking for industry to come together and form consortia proposals. We have a lot of questions around, how that's going to work, what kind of flexibilities are going to be built in, and even simple questions like, can we be part of multiple consortia? Within one consortia proposal, should it just be one company at each layer of the stack, or can it be sort of a range of options? And so we've been having discussions with folks at the Commerce Department and the State Department to, try to get more details, but also to try to provide some guidance around what industry would like to see. The other thing I would note is that, in terms of success, from an industry perspective, we hate to see a scenario where, government is picking winners and losers, but we are excited about an opportunity for sort of the U.S. AI ecosystem to be lifted writ large, and for a lot of different companies to participate in this, depending on what the specific use case is, what region we're targeting. So the more inclusive this is, and the more flexibility it has, I think the more chance this has to be successful.
Thanks, Andres. And if I can just actually stick with you, as you say, the proof is really in the pudding, and kind of digging into the offer itself. What do you think needs to be included from a kind of technical perspective?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So when you look at the executive order, it does describe at a very high level what an AI stack looks like, right? And it talks about the hardware, it talks about the models, AI applications, very sort of simplistic look at an AI stack. At first glance, it's incredibly sort of cloud and data center focused. And I think that makes some sense. There's a huge amount of demand around the world for data center infrastructure, for AI compute infrastructure. But if you talk to the folks in the White House and at OSTP, and you sort of get a sense of how they're viewing this and what it means to them to win the AI race globally, they tell you a couple of things. They say that this is a race for market share, and they say that market share means market share of tokens processed and market share of inference. And so what we've told folks in government is that they should be taking a really holistic view of what an AI stack looks like, and that data center and that cloud infrastructure is obviously a really key pillar of that stool. But if we're looking at inference and winning market share of inference, we have to look at what's happening in inference out in the marketplace. And what's happening is that obviously a lot of inference right now is happening in the data center. But as models are becoming smaller and more capable, and then the hardware on edge devices is becoming more capable, we're seeing more and more inference being done on device. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of a hybrid ecosystem where a lot of the model training happens in the cloud, and then some of the inference happens in the cloud, but then more and more inference is happening at the edge on devices. So on your smartphone, your tablet, your PC, and even your car. Then when we start talking about robotics and drones and other edge use cases, you need a lot of that intelligence to happen on device. And so what we've said is this is an opportunity to think more holistically around what an AI stack looks like. And then as we look globally, everybody's needs, on a region by region basis or on a country by country basis are going to be different. Not everybody has the resources or the need for huge data centers, but everybody needs AI. And the reality is that the way that citizens are going to interact with AI is on devices. And those devices serve as data access points to the cloud. So you really can't, if you want a holistic strategic approach to this, it can't be exclusively cloud focused. That should be a focus, but you have to realize there's this symbiotic relationship with what's happening in the edge.
Thanks. Susie, I'd also like to ask you that question. What do you think should be, or what ought to be in this package, and what works for different countries?
Yeah, in the case of Latin America, that's where I'm going to focus, of course. This is a very peculiar case, because many people would tend to think that Latin America could be like, or could see it as an integrated region. And although we have cultural commonalities and we are integrated in some cultural issues, such as language, for example. In the case of Spanish speaking, Brazil, of course, is a whole continent by itself with a different language element. We are quite different from the European Union, for example, where we cannot see ourselves as a region per se. So in this way, I think the only, in this talking about the AI stack for Latin America, our data are everywhere. We are not really, Latin America doesn't really have this culture about privacy in the same way that Europeans have it, for example. So our data are there, people are using it to train models. We all go and use the applications without really reviewing the privacy. And even if we want, we don't have enforcement to make these policies or agreements to take on board. In the second hand, well, algorithms, we are not competing on that. We are not developing this kind of algorithms of models. However, what we have and that we probably could have a say in this AI stack, as many colleagues already mentioned, is in the infrastructure part of it, building on data centers and how we can make this bring us on into the conversation of the AI globally and how we can work in partnership. So what I want to say is that some countries, given the fact that we are not as an integrated region, economic, in an economic way, or speaking in that element, some countries could get more closer to your economic allies in the north, as the USA and Canada, for example. This is the case for Mexico, but it's not the case for many other countries in the south of Latin America. And and where, in terms of probably policies and regulation frameworks, have had more inclined to be aligned to Europe. For the case of the South American countries, Mexico, for example, is more aligned to the US frameworks, given the USMCA trade agreement. But also, as some other mentioned, China has had a big influence in terms of trying to push and help the countries with infrastructure, and Latin America is not the exception. And if Latin America, the only or the most part of the AI stack that is going to have a voice is in infrastructure, where China has had a variety of help and interference with some countries, then it's probably something that we need to look at, because we as a region culturally could be more integrated, but not in other aspects of developing our economy, developing technology, or developing on the economy. And that probably could be looked at a fragmentation, which is clearly the way for the case of Brazil, for example. Brazil probably could be more aligned to other regions. Mexico, which is the strongest country in the Spanish-speaking Latin American population, we are more aligned to the north. So the challenges with the Latin America is that although we could be perceived as an integrated region, we are not. And that is causing a lot of problems probably for this partnership with the US AI Alliance.
Thanks, Sisi. Kazim, kind of on some of those points that have been raised, on the different kind of needs and how that shapes the offering. You've kind of written about how even when India and Western countries adopt AI in the same sectors, be that banking or healthcare, the problems they're trying to solve can look very different. So what does that mean for how the US is shaping its offering?
Yeah, thank you. And just to sort of complement Sisi's point, I mean, it's great that Latin America is not like Europe, because Latin America doesn't have the EU AI Act, which is a horrible law to govern AI applications. So it's a good thing. But no, going back to your point, so in India and US, we look at this very differently, right? I mean, if you look at India, we are a low resource, high volume, multilingual, trust sensitive environment, right? So offerings in the banking and healthcare services would be largely different because it's low value, high volume transactions in let's suppose in the banking sector, which take place in India, whereas in the US, you're looking at the offering is more from a compute frontier model point of view. I mean, if I were to sort of focus a little bit on, let's say, finance, our priorities are on financial inclusion, KYC, micropayments, the UPI stack, which is serving across millions of people in the country, right? I mean, it differs from how Americans use it, right? I mean, their focus would be on risk scoring toolkits, and even looking at privacy preserving analytics and stuff like that. And that's something which they could also offer when it comes to India. If you look at the healthcare sector, I think our focus is on primary healthcare. So enhancing primary health coverage, point of care in low connectivity areas. That's the kind of requirement we have. And we have supply constraint issues. So how do you meet those gaps? Language is a big aspect in India, right? We have multiple languages, so multilingual consent and safety is going to be important. So I think from the US side, again, and of course the alliance, whatever the alliance looks like, should focus on evaluation frameworks, human in the loop safety patterns, and anonymized data sets, interoperability kits, and of course looking at the digital public infrastructure, which caters to services to the masses in India, and how can the alliance support and grow the digital public infrastructure in India as well. And all these services have to be, low cost services, right? But because of the high volume, I think that is going to be an incentive for the alliance partners to work together. So I think that's where the alliance has to move, and eventually the services have to be tailored to the market, to the people, in a manner that they're able to consume them. And India is becoming the largest use case of AI very soon. So India would play an important role in such an alliance. And I think the offerings would, of course, be tweaked for different geographies. And the diversity which India brings also is a massive opportunity in terms of the market we have for the alliance partners.
Thanks. Sam, I'd love for you to weigh in on both the kind of technical side of this, but also you've emphasized a lot the kind of non-technical pieces are just as important. So, what do you see as the most critical parts of this package?
Yes, I think the kind of two non-technical elements that I think are most important here. One is financing, and then the other is a sort of the diplomatic support at the implementation level, if that is one way to think about that. So on the financing, I think Washington does need to kind of mobilize more capital to deliver sort of genuine economic value for developing and emerging economies. I think that's always been a kind of challenge for the US government here in its attempts to kind of promote US technology overseas. There's the DFC, there's the Export-Import Bank, there's the US Trade and Development Agency. There's a bunch of these kind of export promotion authorities, but in general, I think they're pretty under-resourced. Kind of efforts are kind of divided across these different agencies. They're fragmented, and they're generally like pretty painful to work with, is my sense. And I think so. I think kind of trying to unlock additional finance, I think that's kind of one really important kind of non-technical aspect of this. Both the DFC and EXIM are up for congressional budget reauthorization in the next kind of year or two. So I think that kind of presents opportunities to try to expand the kind of scale of funding for AI infrastructure. There's plenty of ideas out there for how to do that, but things like lower cost kind of concessional financing, kind of loans with more favorable terms, in general, just kind of building in more flexibility and adaptability into these programs to allow US government to kind of direct them towards digital infrastructure. I think that would be very helpful. On the kind of implementation side, I think Washington can help. When it thinks about these kind of export, the executive order on export promotion, I think Washington can really help tech companies sort of try to tailor their offerings for individual countries, to try to kind of build, particularly in public sector applications, to try to kind of navigate relationships between local governments and US tech companies, to try to kind of figure out how to help local actors solve specific needs. And I think the government can help provide some sort of diplomatic assistance to kind of navigate local regulatory requirements and identify reliable partners. But I think the kind of core of this is going to be at the technical level, and it's going to reside with the companies, really. They're the ones who have most of the expertise for doing these things.
Thanks. And I think that kind of brings us nicely onto this, talking about not only the what, but the how. How is this going to be communicated? How's it going to be delivered? And most importantly, how it's going to be sustained. Because an offer, no matter how strong it is, won't go far without kind of, as you say, diplomatic credibility and support. And so I'd kind of like to open it up to all of you on this question of AI sovereignty. I think one of the big themes that always comes up in these conversations is AI sovereignty. Partnering with the US, I think, inevitably raises questions about it. And so how do you understand what's at stake when we talk about sovereignty in this context? Kazim, maybe I'll start with you.
So I think, for India, it's very clear that, we should have, in terms of sovereignty, we should be able to build our own models and be able to contribute locally to all the aspects of the AI supply chain, right? From data to compute, to sort of building models, building AI from India. And, the government is working on a data center policy as well to attract investments and attract data centers from across the globe to build from India, process from India. I think from a sovereignty point of view, the ability for us to be able to source the chips to be able to source all the computing infrastructure which is necessary for us to build the models, to be able to then also look at governance frameworks and be able to drive and contribute to global governance frameworks, which also help India's leadership and grow India's leadership, right? So I think that's going to be very important for us. I think from a standards point of view and accountability point of view as well, having control over that, being able to build our own IP of the models, right? So that is something which is, of course, important aspect for India. And I mean, we have developers in India who are now contributing to model development, and we also have startups who are now building large language models in India as well, right? And being able to compute from here, but at the same time being also able to not rely or be overly dependent across the entire supply chain. Obviously, we are interdependent. We depend on multiple countries to source various compute infrastructure requirements. But going forward, there's a very concerted, very strong effort in India to be able to have our own semiconductors, to build our own chips. So hardware sovereignty is important. Data, of course, is something which India has, and India has very diverse set of data sets as well. So bringing that into account, being able to contribute to standards. Sovereignty doesn't just mean for us that being able to locally develop something, but going beyond borders as well, and being able to influence and being able to inform global governance frameworks, global AI conversations. India was at the presidency of GPI. We recently were at the presidency of G20, and next year we are hosting the India, which is of course the Impact Summit, right? And India is the host country now. So India is already demonstrating leadership, and that's important for our sovereignty, AI sovereignty as well. So all these pillars have to come together. And while we work with our partners, we also would like to have some sort of strategic autonomy when it comes to being able to leverage, develop, and export AI.
Thanks. And from a kind of industry perspective, Andres, how are you thinking about this? Because one can imagine that different levels or different understandings of sovereignty might kind of impact the types of modalities that we're talking about from a technical perspective.
Yeah, so the government partners that we talk to around the world, they talk about AI sovereignty as a strategic imperative, and Kasim touched on this, right? The countries that have the resources and the talent to develop their own homegrown large language models, some they identify as sort of strategic championed by the government. Some are developed in coordination, with the national government in different countries around the world. They view these as national assets and as critical to sort of maintaining their language and culture. And as they think about a world where their citizens are utilizing AI on a day-to-day basis, they think about what it means for those citizens to be using AI that's sort of trained on whether it's English language and English or Western culture, Western history, and then they think about the importance of making sure that there are models that are available for their citizens to choose if they so want to, that are trained on local culture, local values, local history. And so they tell us that for them to be receptive to something like this, there's going to need to be opportunities for local players to participate, and that's going to look differently region to region and country to country. So at the application layer, I think no matter where you go, there are going to be local players that want to be part of what the stack looks like. But in some countries, they're going to want their local models to be included. And I think you could look at the example of some of the AI agreements that the U.S. announced with Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, where what American companies were there as strategic technology providers, but they were working with local companies that had their own models that they wanted to be utilized and integrated for different use cases. So I think that's a model that we can look at. Those countries are unique in terms of the amount of capital that they have available to spend, but what they're trying to accomplish is not unique. And so I think when we think about this AI sovereignty topic from a U.S. perspective and industry perspective, we're hopeful that there will be enough flexibility that we can convince partners around the world that AI sovereignty can be synonymous with U.S. technology, because we understand that there are local partners who have things to offer that we can integrate into the overall technology solution.
Thanks. Since you brought up the UAE, Sam, I know you've kind of really looked at the partnerships and deals that have happened between the US and the UAE and KSA. What can we take from those partnerships? What is a model for what the US is going to be doing for other countries? How should we be thinking about those partnerships?
Yeah, so I think those countries are kind of almost a unique example, just in terms of like the sheer scale of their ambitions, the capital they have, the energy they have to offer, the kind of regulatory speed at which they can move, or at least at which they claim they can move. I think that makes them a kind of fairly. There aren't many countries that are in that category worldwide, and I would say that the Gulf also poses a kind of unique, but because of the scale of their ambitions, poses a fairly unique set of risks as well, in that these are countries that are not kind of close US allies. They have robust ties with US competitors, US adversaries, and so they pose a kind of particular set of kind of dilemmas for US policymakers when you're thinking about building huge scale data centers in these countries. I think for most places around the world that aren't trying to build at quite that scale, there's a very different set of risks and also a different set of opportunities for US tech companies. So I think there are kind of real question marks about whether we can really replicate those deals elsewhere. One element that kind of fed into those deals was that the US had a lot of leverage vis-a-vis the Gulf because of the license requirements that were in place there. So the US government could kind of promise to lift those license requirements in exchange for commitments, whatever those commitments might be, whether it's investments in the US, whether it's export control alignment. For most countries in the world at the moment, those license requirements don't exist. So it's a kind of very different starting point in the kind of negotiations between US and local governments. So I think there are definitely some lessons to draw from the Gulf experience, but I do think they're in kind of a fairly unique category, all of their own, both in terms of the opportunities and the risks that they present.
Thanks. And Sissy, thinking about regional dynamics and this idea of leverage that Sam mentioned, how much do you think in Latin America, you've kind of said each country is operating in different ways, their needs are different, but how much do you think negotiations will happen as a block? Have you thought about how regions organize amongst themselves before they kind of work with the United States? What's your take there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because although we do have a lot of political forums, international forums for the region to discuss a digital agenda that can go in an integrated way, they usually tend to be, as I said, talks. In the public policy and regulation framework, we are, as I mentioned before, we are quite fragmented. Some countries in the south, saying Uruguay, Chile, can be more, even Brazil can be more towards looking at the EU model, the European model, while Mexico, because of obvious reasons, as I said before, the USMCA, we are pretty much aligned to the US. And then some other countries in the Central American region, they are probably doing a copy-paste of some regulations in a different way. So that's a big challenge for us in the way that we can be integrated. However, I'm talking about this sovereignty that we could look at in terms of data or in terms of how can we be integrating. Chile used to tend to look at the leadership or to take the leadership in how we could get this integration. And one of the main examples is this program of Latin GPT, where they are trying to build this region or Latin American big model with the data customized data from the region, gathering partnerships and collaboration from all the countries in terms of providing this data for this big model. In terms of, as I mentioned before, in terms of infrastructure, probably we are in that way, as I said before, Mexico is pretty much very aligned to the US, not only infrastructure, but in pretty much other elements of the AI stack. So I think it needs to be this integration among the region in order to be as a whole block, to be also built up as an US AI alliance, need to be put more attention into it, because we are going in different ways in different elements, as I said before, in terms of public policy, in terms of regulation, in terms of probably even in terms of infrastructure, although there are some efforts to keep these politics of conversations to try to be integration, they are only conversations at a very strategic way that is very hard to be put in place or to be on the ground, to be put in the ground, because obviously what it drives pretty much is the other economical forces, in which we could say that Mexico always looks to the north, other countries look to the to other regions. Like now we could say China is pretty much involved in some conversations and works and talks to other countries. So, as I said before, Latin America could be a big challenge in terms of how we integrate as a whole block, because we are very fragmented. However, the positive thing is that we have a number of regional forums where you could already have the place or the area or the area for the discussions to be in place. We just need to make them to work, because
Right.
they are always keeping just talks and they don't realize or they don't translate in something concrete. So as long as all this disparity and disintegration keeps going, this is going to be a big challenge.
Thanks, Sissy. Kazim, India already has a kind of platform for tech cooperation, with the United States. How important do you think that is as a foundation for kind of deepening AI-specific cooperation?
Yeah, we have what we call the ISET, which basically is like an operating system for India-US tech cooperation, right? So, it provides predictability, it provides speed, and brings both India and US together in terms of co-ownership. And I think that's important because that's the foundation of any partnership when it comes to emerging technologies or AI. ISET is the foundation on which any such collaboration will happen. So let's say, if you're talking about compute, if you're talking about skill development, if you're talking about capacity building, if you're talking about cloud, if you're talking about even tech transfer, all of this can be packaged within the framework of ISET, right? And that gives India an advantage when it comes to, of course, our bilateral relationship with the US. And it also is a necessary, important aspect of the bilateral relationship, because I think both countries recognize that for the democratic world order to survive and grow and thrive in the AI race, India and US have to come together. And that is going to happen through the ISET framework, obviously. Countries which do not have such frameworks, of course, will face probably different kind of challenges. And if you're just looking at turnkey packages, of course, one-off packages or collaborations would work well, but having a framework through which you're looking at a roadmap of 10 to 20 years between two countries, I think that definitely gives India and US both an advantage to collaborate with each other, and therefore, also drive and lead the growth of Global South and the growth of AI in Global South, right? And bringing that view forward. I think ISET is an important vision to turn these realities into deliverables, and for India and US to co-author this alliance. But going forward, I think it will be important also, for not just India, US, but other like-minded countries as well, to explore the gaps which exist currently in the global South. And I think there's no disagreement that infrastructure is the big gap which we are seeing right now, which has to be plugged in. And it's important to reiterate that there are other countries or other blocs which can offer subsidized compute, okay, and also offer models which may not need high powered or super fast or super strong compute requirements in the first place itself. So which is why the alliance is imperative. It's the need of the hour. And this is where I think joint research centers or joint research collaborations between leading members of the alliance, for example, India and US and other nations, like-minded nations, should come together and build that roadmap. What we have not seen is that roadmap being discussed in any of the previous AI summits. We hope that will be the case next year. And we also hope that we'll have a future trajectory of growth for the global South, in terms of aligning itself with the standards. And when we talk about AI standards, I think it'll be important to cater into the requirements of all parties and of all countries by bringing them together and making sure that they have a say at the table. So while countries like India, US would be sort of driving this forward, I think it'll be premature for anybody to claim that one country has more power over the other. Everybody should come together, whatever they can contribute, and being able to sort of develop this alliance into something meaningful.
Thanks, Kazim. You mentioned cost, and Andres, I wanted to come back to you on this point. How important cost is, and whether there is a sort of technological solution to this side beyond kind of direct economic support. How can we make the AI we're offering cheaper?
Yeah, it's a good question. Cost is going to be an important element to the success of this on the export promotion side. The U.S. government has made clear that what it's looking to accomplish is to make the export of American AI technology easier, right? And so part of that is these consortia proposals and tying them to specific needs around the world. But we know that oftentimes, a just good enough or a good enough solution, even if it may not be the best solution, if it's good enough and more economic in terms of cost, then that becomes much more attractive for our partners around the world that we're trying to get to join this alliance. So I think industry has an important part to play. We need to think creatively about how we lower cost. I think one way that we can do that is to, and this has been alluded to by my fellow panelists, we need to target specific proposals to specific countries of regions where we can scale up these specific use cases because those use cases are of particular relevance to that country or region. So energy-related AI use cases in the Middle East, for example, right? Those aren't going to be as attractive in other parts of the world. The executive order on export promotion listed it as an example some specific use cases: healthcare, transportation, agriculture. And so if the better job we do in tailoring the proposals to the specific needs for each country, and then thinking creatively about how we can scale those use cases up in those particular countries or regions, then we on the industry side can think about how, with scale, we could potentially address some of the cost issues. And then that financing piece that's going to be part of this is really critical as well. The countries that have been really successful in doing this sort of thing have made it easy to adopt their technology, not just because they make it available, but also because they're very creative in terms of different flexible financing options for these types of projects. And the United States needs to think about that, really creatively, and making sure that that financing piece is also, a key strategic pillar to making this a success.
Thanks. And just a reminder to everyone watching at home that you can ask questions of our panelists via Slido. So please ask questions if you have some. Sam, one thing we haven't really talked about is around sort of the security side of this. And I know you've kind of written about security. How much is the kind of reliability part of this important? Countries being concerned that they might get cut off, or that they have certain types of workloads that are, of national security importance. How should that factor into how the US is thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it factors in from kind of both sides, from both the US government side and from the governments the governments on the other side of these negotiations. From the US government side, I think advanced AI chips are likely to have critical national security implications. The last two administrations there's been a kind of bipartisan consensus for some time now that we want to restrict US competitors' access to advanced AI chips, in particular China. So, cracking down on things like chip smuggling, remote access to data centers, those are kind of national security concerns that many policymakers in DC will have. And I think that's totally fair for them to have those concerns. And so particularly for large scale chip purchases, really large scale orders, I think that comes with a set of risks, a set of national security risks that the Washington kind of has to take seriously. And that will often push policymakers towards emphasizing things like cloud rather than just sales of direct chips without any precautions. It will push them more towards remote access to US data centers and US cloud services. But the flip side of that is that many of those, because that gives the US government more kind of control, more leverage, more insight into what those models are being used for, that may be less appealing for countries on the other end of these negotiations, especially if those countries are kind of afraid that US AI exports will be used as a source of leverage and a source of kind of coercion by the US government to kind of shape their foreign policy and economic policy priorities. So kind of navigating the US government's kind of natural and understandable desire to kind of want a robust set of national security safeguards on many of these deals with host government, with local governments' concerns that will leave them vulnerable, that those safeguards will leave them vulnerable to US leverage, US coercion. I think that's a kind of tricky needle to thread. And I think that the US government's desire to kind of promote AI exports and to kind of signal that they're a long-term reliable partner sometimes fits uneasily with the broader trade policies of the administration, which sometimes signal a kind of more blunt use of US leverage and US kind of coercion to extract kind of concessions in the short run. So figuring out how to kind of message that is not going to be straightforward for US diplomats, but that's kind of one challenge to make this work.
Thanks. I also want to bring you in on this question, Sissy, because I know you have a lot of experience on the cybersecurity side. How are kind of countries thinking about this?
Yeah, I think the way to go is, as Andres mentioned it before, we need to have these partnerships. In the case of Mexico, for example, where there is been a lot of data center being built up by the big, large companies, and where indeed we have this concern before. I mean, one of the examples precisely for the data center, it was that in the last, in the USMCA trade agreement, in the digital trade chapter, there was a clause talking about cloud or data centers, where basically the clause said we shouldn't really be forcing data centers in order to promote cloud. In the secondary laws, when the Bank of Mexico put secondary laws, they have these fears of security and blocking services and so on. So they put an extra secondary law indicating that for fintech and fintech developments, they needed to have a two-way provider data set storage, which make it complicated. Now everything changed that quickly. I mean, that trade agreement was signed probably in 2017, 2016. Now we are gonna go to a review. Sorry, 2018. Now we're going to go to a review where all these changes. So having now a large data infrastructure, data center being put in place in the country where the big, large companies are financing this infrastructure, we really need to ensure that there is these partnerships with local providers that in a way or another one, when there is a kind of concern about security of blockage, you can rely on the partner to be able to provide this accessibility to the data if there is the case. Also, I think something that needs to be revised now that cybersecurity is more of a concern across globally, not only in the region, is, for example, for the case of Mexico, this review or revised USMCA agreement. It needs to be pretty much a better detail on how this collaboration among the countries is going to be working or is going to happen. So that's probably where I would say, Andres said before, we need to go into local partnerships or partnerships with the governments and with local providers as well in order to make these probably public-private partnerships.
Thank you. And we are coming up to the hour, so I just want to kind of end on one question for you all, which is, if you could leave US policymakers with one message about what it will take to make AI partnerships with the Global South work, what would it be? Andres, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think this has been alluded to throughout the discussion. The approach can't just be building technology for these partners. It needs to be building technology with these partners. And then I would just stress again the importance of taking a really holistic view to what that AI stack looks like, and not a completely cloud and data center focused view.
Thanks. Kazim.
I think joint research and joint IP.
Thanks. Sam?
I would emphasize that although in DC, the kind of language that's most appealing is a framing of competing with China, promoting US exports to compete with China, I would frame it much more around helping countries solve real local economic problems that they're dealing with together with them, as Andres said. So reduce framing on US-China competition, more on just pragmatic problem solving with local partners.
Thanks. And Sissy?
I would say public-private partnerships in order to leverage this infrastructure financing and also boost innovation.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Clearly, there are many more discussions to be had about this, and those will continue to unfold. But I think this conversation has really been insightful and a great kind of starting point, at least for our work. A huge thank you to all our panelists for sharing their perspectives, and to everyone who joined us at home. Thank you so much.